The hand connected with her jaw, not with the explosive crack of a gunshot, but with the dense, sickening thud of a heavy object striking packed earth. For a sliver of a second, the world went silent, the ambient hum of the hospital corridor, the squeak of rubber soles, the distant, cheerful beep of a heart monitor, the low murmur of concerned families. All of it was devoured by the white noise roaring in Alara's ears. Her head snapped to the side, her hair, a sheet of dark silk, flying across her face to veil the impact. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She did not even gasp. Years of practice had taught her that any sound she made would be twisted into fuel. Her reaction was his victory, her pain, his nourishment. So she held the sound inside, a shard of glass in her throat, and stood perfectly still as the universe tilted on its axis, and then, with excruciating slowness, righted itself. The man before her, Marcus Rinaldi, lowered his hand. His posture was one of relaxed ownership, as if he had just adjusted a painting that was hanging slightly askew. He looked down at her, his handsome face, the one that graced the society pages, twisted into a mask of contemptuous possession. Behind him, a massive, funereal arrangement of white lilies stood propped against the wall, their cloying scent a declaration of war in the sterile hallway. They were an insult, a threat wrapped in cellophane. What happens next will change everything. He thought this was the end of a chapter, a final assertion of his control. He was wrong. This was the end of his world. Alara Vance had been living in a state of quiet exhaustion for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the exact duration because she was a woman who dealt in precision. As the lead cardiac nurse on the most demanding floor of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, she measured life in titrated drips, in milliseconds on an ECG, in the fractional rise and fall of blood oxygen levels. Her own life had become a similar equation of endurance, a careful balancing of risk and survival. The exhaustion was not the kind that could be cured by sleep. It was a deeper, more structural fatigue. It was the weariness of a foundation that has borne too much weight for too long. It had settled into her bones, a fine silt of dread that colored every sunrise and tainted every moment of peace. Her peace, what little she had, was found here, within the pale green walls of the hospital. Here, she was not Marcus Rinaldi's beautiful, tragic project. She was not the woman he paraded at galas, her silence mistaken for demure contentment. Here, she was Nurse Vance. She was competence personified. She moved through the chaos of life and death with a grace that was almost unnerving, her hands steady, her voice a low, calming constant in rooms filled with panic. She could read a monitor from across the hall and diagnose a subtle arrhythmia before the machine even registered it as a critical alert. Doctors, residents, even the formidable chief of surgery deferred to her judgment. In this domain, she was sovereign. Her authority was earned, not claimed. It was quiet, effective, and absolute. It was everything his was not. Marcus's power was a performance. It was loud and brittle and required an audience. He was a man who had inherited a criminal empire that was more name than substance, a hollowed-out dynasty propped up by his father's lingering reputation. He ruled through bluster and intimidation, his cruelty a frantic effort to convince others and himself of a strength he did not possess. He had found Alara when she was at her most vulnerable, grieving the loss of her parents and buried in their medical debt. He had presented himself as a savior, paying off her loans with a grand gesture that was less about charity and more about acquisition. He had purchased her, he believed, and for a time, her gratitude and isolation had kept her compliant. But she was not an object. She was not a possession. She was a woman of immense, quiet strength, and she had begun the slow, terrifying process of extricating herself from his life. She had moved out of the penthouse he kept for her, taking a small, anonymous apartment across town. She had stopped answering his calls. She had returned his gifts. Each act was a small declaration of independence, and each one had escalated his fury. He could not comprehend it. He had not updated the file on her. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, a fiction he had constructed to soothe his own ego. In his mind, she was a delicate thing he had rescued, something that ought to remain beautifully, gratefully broken. Her resilience was an affront, her competence an insult, so he had come here, to her sanctuary, to remind her of his ownership. The lilies were the first violation. Their funereal scent was a message everyone in their world would understand, a threat of mourning. Now the slap was the second, a cruder, more public declaration. His knuckles were slightly red. He flexed his fingers, the picture of casual brutality. "You have been ignoring me," he said, his voice low and menacing, a stark contrast to the public charm he usually affected. That was a mistake. Around them, the life of the corridor had faltered. Her colleague, Anya, stood frozen by the nurse's station, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and helplessness. A junior resident, a young man who had hero-worshipped Ilara since his first day, took a half-step forward before a senior doctor subtly shook his head, a silent warning. They all knew who Marcus Rinaldi was, or who he purported to be. They were civilians in a war they did not understand, and their instincts screamed for non-engagement. Their inaction was not a betrayal. It was survival. But it left Ilara utterly alone, an island in a sea of averted eyes. She lifted her chin, the movement precise and deliberate. She met his gaze. The roaring in her ears subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her stomach, but for the first time it was accompanied by something else, a final, definitive severance, the last thread of obligation, of gratitude, of fear-induced loyalty had just been violently snapped. "Let go of my arm, Marcus," she said. Her voice was not a plea. It was a command, as clear and steady as any she gave in the operating theater. He had grabbed her arm in the moments after the slap, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow, a physical anchor for his authority. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You don't give me orders. You have an obligation. To me. You seem to have forgotten that." He tightened his grip, pulling her slightly off balance. "We're going to go somewhere private and discuss your responsibilities." She did not struggle. She simply stood, her weight grounded, her spine straight. She had learned that resisting him physically was pointless and only served to excite his cruelty. Her power was in her stillness, her refusal to participate in his drama. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Anya was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face. The senior doctor was discreetly trying to wave down a hospital security guard, but the guard, a man named Henderson who knew Rinaldi by sight, was suddenly preoccupied with a loose tile on the floor. It was in this moment of absolute isolation, of public humiliation and private terror, that a new sound entered the tableau. It was not a loud sound. It was the quiet, rhythmic fall of expensive leather shoes on polished linoleum. Steady, unhurried. Each footstep landed with a weight that seemed to press the air out of the hallway. It was the kind of sound that did not need to announce itself. It simply was. The sound grew closer. It did not rush. It was not performing. It was the sound of inevitability. Marcus felt the change before he saw it. The subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the ambient tension in the corridor suddenly coalesced, focusing on a point behind him. The performance had been interrupted by a new, uninvited actor. He turned his head, irritation flashing across his features, ready to dismiss whoever dared to intrude on his scene. And then he saw him. Jinwoo Kwon stood about 20 feet away, a still point in the turning world. He was a man made of quiet absolutes. He wore a charcoal suit that was so exquisitely tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His hands were empty at his sides. His expression was placid, almost dispassionate. He was not looking at Marcus. His gaze, dark and unreadable, was fixed on the point where Marcus's fingers dug into Ilara's arm. A different kind of silence fell. Not the awkward, fearful silence of witnesses afraid to intervene. This was a new quality of quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. It was the silence of deference. The senior doctor, who had been trying to get the guard's attention, now stood perfectly still, his posture one of sudden, profound respect. The security guard, Henderson, looked up from his fascinating floor tile and his face went pale. Jinwoo Kwon was the chairman of Kwon Industries, a global conglomerate with holdings in technology, shipping, and private finance. He was also, in the circles that Marcus desperately tried to dominate, understood to be the head of the Cheongyang Syndicate, the Korean organization that operated with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Where the Rinaldi family was a crumbling monument to old-world thuggery, the Kwon Syndicate was a sleek, modern, brutally efficient corporation. Marcus played at being a wolf. Jinwoo Kwon was the winter that starved the wolves. Marcus's grip on Alara's arm went slack. His arrogance, a cheap and flimsy garment, evaporated under Kwon's neutral gaze. He knew exactly who this man was. Everyone did. Kwon was a ghost, a rumor, a man who rarely appeared in public but whose influence was a structural reality of their city. To see him here, in a hospital corridor, was like finding a shark in a swimming pool. It was wrong. It was terrifying. Kwon began to walk toward them. His pace did not change. It remained slow, deliberate, each step eating up the distance with unhurried purpose. As he drew closer, a man in an identical, though slightly less expensive, suit materialized at his side. This was Mr. Choi, Kwon's assistant, a man who was said to be more of an extension of Kwon's will than a separate person. Mr. Choi's eyes, unlike his employer's, were on Marcus, and they were cold and flat as polished stone. Kwon stopped a few feet away. He still had not looked at Marcus's face. His attention remained on the hand. Then he spoke. His voice was low, almost a murmur, yet it cut through the heavy silence with the precision of a scalpel. "Let go of her arm." It was the same sentence Alara had spoken, but where her words had been a defiant assertion of will, his were a statement of fact, a declaration of an inevitable outcome. It was not a request to be considered. It was a description of what was about to happen. Marcus's hand fell away from Alara's arm as if it had been burned, a clumsy, reflexive retreat. He tried to muster some of his earlier bravado to reassemble the fragments of his shattered dominance. "Kwon, this is a private matter," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "A disagreement between me and my fiancé." The lie hung in the air, pathetic and transparent. Alara flinched at the word, a small, involuntary movement. For the first time, Kwon's eyes lifted. They moved from her arm to her face. He saw the faint, angry red mark blooming on her cheek. He saw the exhaustion she could no longer hide. He saw the tremor in her hands. He saw all of it. His expression did not change, but a new stillness settled over him, the deep, cold calm of a northern sea. He finally turned his gaze to Marcus. It was a brief, dismissive glance, the sort one might give to an insect on a windshield. "Mr. Rinaldi was just leaving," Kwon said, his voice still quiet. He was not speaking to Marcus. He was addressing Mr. Choi. It was a command wrapped in the politeness of a business directive. Two more men, dressed in the same dark suits, had appeared at the end of the corridor. They moved without wasted motion, their presence professional and absolute. They flanked Marcus, not touching him, but their proximity was a cage. Marcus's face, which had been pale, now flushed with a desperate, impotent rage. "You have no right. This is my business. She is my business." Kwon did not reply. He simply turned his back on Marcus, a gesture of dismissal so profound it was more insulting than any blow. He took a half-step toward Alara, creating a subtle barrier with his own body, shielding her from the spectacle of Marcus's disintegration. "We need to go," Mr. Choi said to Marcus, his voice polite but unyielding. When Marcus hesitated, one of the other men took his arm, his grip respectful but firm as a vice. Marcus was not dragged. He was escorted. He was managed. His loud, violent power had been dismantled by a quiet, structural force that he could not fight because he could not even properly comprehend it. He was removed from the scene as one would remove a disruptive piece of furniture. As he was led away, his final, desperate shout echoed down the hall. "She'll come back! You'll see! She always comes back!" And then he was gone. The corridor was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed once more. The fear was gone. The tension had vanished. All that remained was a kind of stunned, breathless quiet. Ilara stood in the eye of this new calm, the ghost of Marcus's grip still burning on her arm, the mark on her face a throbbing testament to the last 5 minutes. Anya rushed to her side, her face a mess of tears and relief. "Ilara, are you okay? My God, I was so scared." Ilara could only nod, the motion stiff. Her body was still braced for a fight that was already over. Her gaze was on the man in the charcoal suit. Jinwoo Kwon had not moved. He stood watching her, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, more observant. It was the look of a man who was finally seeing something, or someone, in their correct resolution. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice the same low, steady tone. He gestured with his chin toward a small, private waiting room reserved for surgeons. "Please, a moment." She hesitated for only a second. She looked at Anya, who squeezed her hand in reassurance, then back at Kwon. There was no threat in his posture, no demand in his voice. There was only a quiet, waiting stillness. She walked past him into the small room. The door clicked softly shut behind them, sealing them in a world of profound and sudden silence. Inside the room, there was a small leather sofa and 2 chairs, all in a muted gray. A single window looked out onto a small, manicured courtyard. Kwon did not sit. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, giving her space, giving her time to breathe. The gesture was so unexpected, so considerate, that it almost broke the dam of her control. She had been handled, managed, and manhandled for so long that a simple act of spatial respect felt like an overwhelming kindness. Mr. Choi entered without knocking, placed a cold bottle of water on the small table beside her, and left just as silently. She stared at the bottle. Condensation beaded on its surface. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the cold seep into her skin, a grounding sensation. After a long moment, Kwon spoke, his voice still directed at the window pane. "My mother is a patient on this floor. Room 712. Aortic valve replacement." The information was so mundane, so unexpected, it short-circuited her racing thoughts. Room 712. Mrs. Kwon. A sweet, formidable old woman with sharp eyes and a surprisingly dry wit. Ilara had been overseeing her post-operative care for the past week. She was a model patient, stoic, polite, and unfailingly compliant, though she often made wry comments about the quality of the hospital's kimchi. "I have been here every day for the past 10 days, Kwon continued, his voice a low rumble. "I have seen you work. I made inquiries." He paused. "The chief of surgery, Dr. Albright, refers to you as his failsafe. He says you have the best hands and the calmest heart he has ever seen in a medical professional." Ilara felt a flush of surprise. She had always thought Albright barely tolerated her. To hear her own competence reflected back at her by this man in this moment was profoundly disorienting. "I also made other inquiries," Kwon said, and now he turned from the window to face her. His eyes were direct, holding no artifice. "I became aware of your association with Marcus Rinaldi. I also became aware that you were taking steps to end it. My sources indicated he was not responding well to your resignation." The corporate metaphor was so precise, so chillingly accurate, that a small, hysterical laugh almost escaped her. Her resignation. That's what it was. She had been an employee in an enterprise of his making, and she had tendered her notice. "He will not bother you again," Kwon stated. It was not a promise. It was a weather forecast. His organization has several key dependencies: shipping logistics, import financing, political goodwill. These are areas in which my own organization has a certain structural advantage. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. He was laying out the schematics of a war that had already been won. Marcus Rinaldi was a house of cards, and Jin Woo Kwon owned the table it was built on. Elara finally found her voice. "Why?" It came out as a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Kwon considered the question for a moment, his head tilted slightly. "My mother is fond of you," he said, as if that explained everything. "She says you have clean hands and an honest face. She finds your presence calming. Her recovery is my primary concern. Mr. Rinaldi's public theatrics were a potential disruption to her peace, and to yours. Therefore, he became a problem to be solved." It was so simple, so transactional, and yet it felt like more than that. He was not looking at her as a problem to be solved. He was looking at her as a person who had been in the way of a problem. "Your apartment is not secure," he continued, shifting topics with the same seamless efficiency. "Mr. Rinaldi is a man of limited imagination, but predictable escalations. He will interpret today's events as a challenge. He will likely target your home. My car is waiting downstairs. It will take you to a property I maintain in the city, a penthouse suite at the Azure. It is secure. You will be safe there." A cage for a cage. The thought was immediate, instinctual. She had just escaped one gilded prison. Was she walking into another? She looked at him, searching his face for any hint of the same possessive fire she saw in Marcus. There was none. His expression was impassive, his eyes clear. He was not making a passionate offer. He was presenting a logistical solution. "I have to work," she said, the words a flimsy shield. "I can't just disappear." "You will be brought here tomorrow for your shift," he replied, already having anticipated the objection, "and taken back in the evening. Your routine will not be disrupted, only secured." He paused, and for the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Miss Vance, you have been managing a volatile and dangerous variable for a very long time. Allow me to handle the variables for a while. You have more important work to do." He gestured vaguely in the direction of his mother's room. The sharp terror of the last hour was finally receding, replaced by the deep, bone-weary exhaustion she had been holding at bay. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical illness. The idea of not having to look over her shoulder, of not having to check for unfamiliar cars on her street, of not having to sleep with a chair wedged under her doorknob. It was a luxury she had forgotten how to even imagine. She gave a single sharp nod. "Okay." The word hung in the air between them, an agreement, a transfer of trust, a step into a new, unknown territory. Jin Woo Kwon did not smile. He simply gave a slight inclination of his head, an acknowledgement of a contract signed. The matter was handled. The Azure penthouse was less a home and more a statement on the nature of silence. It was a vast, minimalist space of glass, steel, and pale wood, occupying the entire top floor of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The silence here was different from the tense quiet of her small apartment or the functional quiet of the hospital. This was an engineered silence, a deep and profound stillness that absorbed sound, the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. It was the silence of absolute security, of being so high above the city that its noise was reduced to a distant, abstract hum. Elara walked through the space, her footsteps making no sound on the soft gray rugs. A wall of glass offered a panoramic view of the city, a glittering tapestry of light and life that felt a million miles away. Everything was perfect, impersonal. A collection of beautiful, expensive objects arranged in a way that suggested no one actually lived here. It was a safe house, not a home. For the first 2 days, she existed in a state of profound disorientation. A part of her was coiled tight, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the price of this safety to be revealed. Kwon was true to his word. A silent driver in a dark car brought her to the hospital before dawn and collected her after her shift. Mr. Choi would call once a day, his voice a polite, dispassionate hum. "Mr. Kwon sends his regards. Is there anything you require?" She always said no. A chef had been provided, a man who introduced himself as Eric and who could apparently craft a Michelin star meal from thin air. On the first night, he presented her with a perfectly seared piece of sea bass on a bed of saffron risotto. She thanked him, ate 2 bites, and then could eat no more. The next evening she found the kitchen, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel, and politely informed Eric that she preferred to cook for herself. He looked momentarily confused, as if a piece of furniture had expressed a preference, but he bowed and vacated the space. That night, she made herself a simple bowl of soup and toast. The small, domestic act was a reclamation, a quiet insistence on her own agency. She was grappling with the vertiginous relief of being protected. For years, every decision had been filtered through a lens of fear. What would Marcus think? How would he react? Her entire life had been a complex negotiation with his volatile ego. Now, that pressure was gone. The sudden absence of it left a void, a strange, unnerving peace. She was angry at herself for feeling grateful. She was furious at Marcus for making this protection necessary. She was wary of Kwon, this quiet sovereign who had rearranged her life with a few calm words and the invisible mechanics of his immense power. She did not want to be a damsel. She had never been one. She was a survivor, a professional, a woman who had pulled herself from the wreckage of her life and built something new. But she had to admit, the wreckage had still been smoldering, and Marcus had been standing over it, ready to fan the flames. Kwon had not saved her. He had perhaps merely extinguished the fire. Meanwhile, in boardrooms and back alleys across the city, Jin-Woo Kwon was not merely extinguishing the fire, he was salting the earth. His actions were quiet, precise, and devastatingly effective. They were not moves on a chessboard, they were adjustments to the board itself. The Rinaldi family's primary legitimate income came from a network of high-end Italian food import businesses. On the third day of Alara's stay at the Azure, a small, unassuming logistics company, Oceanic Freight Solutions, which handled nearly 70% of Rinaldi's shipping from Europe, was acquired in a swift, all-cash deal by a holding company based in Singapore. The holding company was, of course, a subsidiary of Kwon Industries. The next day, shipping rates for all Rinaldi-affiliated accounts tripled, citing a new risk assessment surcharge. Marcus's political connections also began to fray. A city councilman who had been in his pocket for years suddenly became unavailable, his calls going straight to a frazzled assistant who spoke of a sudden urgent ethics review. A friendly judge recused himself from a pending zoning case crucial to a Rinaldi real estate venture, citing an unforeseen conflict of interest that had been brought to his attention. These were not attacks, they were corrections. Kwon was not engaging Marcus in a war. He was simply rebalancing a system that Marcus's bluster had knocked out of alignment. He did this all from his office, a space as minimalist and silent as the penthouse, with a few quiet phone calls and encrypted messages. He was not emotional about it. He was not angry. He was a man pruning a diseased branch from a tree. On the fourth evening, he came to the penthouse. There was no announcement. He simply let himself in with his own key. Alara was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a salad, the rhythmic thump of the knife a comforting sound in the vast silence. She tensed when she saw him, her hand tightening on the knife. He stopped just inside the doorway, holding his hands up in a gesture that was almost placating. "I apologize. I should have called." He was not wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked younger, less like an abstract concept of power, and more like a man at the end of a long day. "It's your apartment," she said, her tone neutral. She turned back to her chopping. He walked closer, stopping at the edge of the large kitchen island that separated them. He watched her hands for a moment, the efficient, precise movements of the blade. "My mother asked me to thank you," he said. "Her doctor said her recovery is progressing ahead of schedule. He credits her excellent post-operative care. "Your mother is a strong woman," Alara replied, not looking up. "She's the one doing the work." "She would agree with you," he said. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "She would also say, 'You're being too modest.'" They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the steady rhythm of the knife. He did not seem uncomfortable with the lack of conversation. He seemed to exist within it as naturally as a fish in water. "I brought something," he said, placing a simple paper bag on the counter. He reached inside and pulled out a container of what looked like homemade kimchi. "My mother insisted." She claims the hospital's version is an insult to her ancestors. Despite herself, Alara felt a genuine smile tug at her lips. "She's not wrong." "She said to tell you that you should eat, that you are too thin," he reported, his tone perfectly deadpan. "She believes my presence is likely making you nervous and that I should leave immediately after delivering the kimchi, unless you were to offer me some of your salad, which would be a polite way of allowing me to stay without my having to ask." Alara paused, knife in hand, and finally looked at him. She saw the dry wit in his eyes, a reflection of his mother's. The carefully constructed walls of her wariness developed a small crack. "Your mother is very direct. She is a woman who has no time for things that are not true," he said. She found herself sliding a large ceramic bowl across the island. "There's enough for two." That was their first meal. They ate at the vast kitchen island, the glittering city spread out below them like a fallen constellation. They did not talk about Marcus. They did not talk about danger or protection. They talked about her work. She described the intricate dance of a bypass surgery, the controlled chaos of the cardiac ICU. He listened with an unnerving focus, his questions sharp and insightful. He asked about hospital administration, about supply chain inefficiencies, about the psychological toll on medical staff. He was not making small talk. He was gathering data. In turn, he spoke about his own world, but in abstract terms. He talked about systems, about leverage points, about the difference between visible power and structural power. "Anyone can knock over a piece on the board," he said, looking out at the city lights. "It is more efficient to own the company that makes the pieces." It was the beginning of a slow, cautious thaw. He began to visit every other evening. Sometimes he brought work, sitting silently at one end of the massive living room while she read at the other. Other times they would share a simple meal. Their conversations were quiet, respectful explorations. He never pushed, never pried. He simply created a space of safety and waited for her to choose to occupy it. He saw her not as a beautiful object or a damsel in distress, but as a highly competent professional, an intellect equal to his own. For the first time in years, Alara felt herself being seen correctly. It was a feeling more intoxicating than any declaration of passion, more reassuring than any promise. It was the quiet, steady peace of finding yourself in the right place, with the right person, even if you didn't yet understand how you got there. And in that peace, something new and fragile began to grow. Marcus Rinaldi was a man living in a house whose foundations were being systematically dissolved, but his arrogance was such that he was admiring the paint job on the walls. He was hemorrhaging money. His shipments were delayed indefinitely. His contacts were ghosting him. But in his mind, these were temporary setbacks, logistical snafus that could be fixed. The true source of his problems, the core of his rage, was Alara. "Give her 3 days. She'll be begging to come back," he had boasted to his dwindling inner circle. 3 days had become a week. A week became 10 days. His bravado curdled into a venomous, obsessive fury. He saw her, once, getting into a sleek black car after her shift. The car's license plate was untraceable. The men who flanked her moved with a quiet professionalism that made his own thuggish bodyguards look like amateur actors. He saw the hand of Jin Woo Kwon in everything. His delusion was epic. He did not see Kwon as a superior power. He saw him as a rival, a poacher who had stolen his prize. He believed Alara was with Kwon for his money, for the status. It never occurred to him that she might be with Kwon for the silence, for the absence of men like him. His understanding of her was so fundamentally flawed, so filtered through the lens of his own transactional worldview, that he could not conceive of a reality where she simply wanted to be left alone. "She's playing him," he told his lawyer, a man whose primary legal strategy was aggressive invoicing. "She's a black widow. We need to expose her. We need to show him what he's gotten himself into." And so, he escalated. It was his only move. He was a man with a hammer, and every problem looked like a nail. He couldn't get to her physically. Kwon's security was a silent, invisible fortress. So he decided to attack her reputation, to drag her into the mud where he was most comfortable. He filed a lawsuit. It was a masterpiece of malicious fiction, a rambling, incoherent document filled with slander and lies. It claimed Alara was his fiancée and that she had absconded with over $200,000 worth of jewelry and cash. It demanded the return of these assets and filed for an emergency restraining order against her, ridiculously claiming he was in fear for his safety. It was a desperate, public, and profoundly stupid act. It was designed to humiliate her, to force her into a public legal battle that would drain her resources and tarnish her name. The papers were served by a smirking process server as she left the hospital one afternoon. He shoved the thick envelope into her hands in front of a crowd of her colleagues, an echo of the first confrontation in the hallway. This time, however, the onlookers were not fearful. They were angry on her behalf. Anya snatched the papers from the server's hand. "Get away from her, you parasite!" The senior doctor, Albright, put a protective arm around Alara's shoulders and guided her back inside. In the azure penthouse that evening, she read the document, her face a pale mask of fury. The lies were so audacious, so grotesque. He had twisted every gift into a loan, every shared moment into a contractual obligation. He was attempting to retroactively rewrite their history into a business arrangement that she had violated. Jinwoo Kwon arrived to find her standing by the window, the legal papers scattered on the floor. He did not ask what was wrong. He knelt, gathered the papers, and began to read. He read all 27 pages without a change in his expression. His stillness was absolute. When he finished, he carefully stacked the pages and placed them on the table. "This is good," he said, his voice calm. Alara stared at him, incredulous. "Good? He's accusing me of being a thief. He's dragging my name through the mud. He's lying." "Yes," Kwon agreed. "He is lying, publicly, in a sworn legal document. He has just handed my lawyers a gift." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "He believes he is fighting you in a gutter. He does not realize he has just stepped into a sterile operating theater, and my legal team are the surgeons." But this was only part of the trap. The lawsuit was the bait. The true stage for Marcus's final spectacular self-destruction was yet to be set. The annual Obsidian Gala, the city's premier charity event, was in 2 weeks. It was a gathering of the city's true power players, finance, tech, politics, and, in the shadowed corners, men like Kwon and Rinaldi. It was a place for peacocks to display their feathers. A few days later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived for Alara, delivered by a special messenger from Kwon's office. Inside was an engraved invitation to the Obsidian Gala. Tucked alongside it was a handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The handwriting was elegant, precise. "Miss Vance, I would be honored if you would accompany me. It is time for people to see you as I do. J.K." She knew, with a cold certainty, what this was. It was a move in his silent war. Her presence at his side would be a public declaration. It would be a calculated provocation, an irresistible target for Marcus's wounded pride. She was being asked to be the cheese in the mousetrap. Her first instinct was to refuse, to hide, to not participate in this dangerous game of titans. But then she looked at the lawsuit, still sitting on her table. She thought of the humiliation in the hospital corridor. She thought of 3 years of walking on eggshells, of making herself smaller to accommodate his enormous, fragile ego. Her exhaustion had been replaced by a slow-burning, cold anger. She was not the cheese. She was part of the trap. She picked up the phone and called Mr. Choi. "Please inform Mr. Kwan," she said, her voice steady and clear, "that I accept his invitation." The night of the Obsidian Gala arrived on a wave of cold, clear air. The city glittered below the azure penthouse, a carpet of diamonds thrown on black velvet. Ilara stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a stranger to herself. The woman in the reflection was not the quiet, competent nurse in scrubs. She was not the frightened woman hiding in a secure apartment. The woman in the mirror was a queen. The gown was a creation of deep, emerald green silk that seemed to drink the light. It was not ostentatious. It was architecturally precise, with clean lines that draped over her form, hinting at strength rather than fragility. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck. Her only jewelry was a pair of simple diamond earrings, a gift that had appeared on her dresser that morning, with a note that said only, "A loan, not a gift," to be returned at the end of the evening. It was a gesture of profound understanding. When Jinwoo Kwan arrived, he stopped in the doorway. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that was the sartorial equivalent of a panther, sleek, powerful, and utterly devoid of unnecessary ornament. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his usual impassive mask momentarily cracking to reveal a flicker of raw appreciation. "You are," he began, then stopped, as if searching for a word that was sufficient. He settled for magnificent. "You clean up well yourself, Mr. Kwan," she replied, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. His own smile was a rare, fleeting thing, but it reached his eyes. "My mother says I look like a penguin, a respectable, wealthy penguin." The shared moment of light humor was a small island of calm before the storm. As they descended in the private elevator, the mood shifted. The air grew heavy with unspoken purpose. "He will be there," Kwan said, his voice low. "He will not be able to resist. His pride will demand a confrontation." "I know," Ilara said. She was not afraid. The fear had been burned out of her, replaced by a cold, resolute calm. She was no longer a pawn in his game. She was a willing participant in his downfall. The ballroom of the Grand Imperial Hotel was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The air hummed with the sound of champagne flutes, discreet laughter, and the murmur of 1,000 powerful conversations. As Kwan and Ilara entered, a subtle ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. His presence alone was an event. Her presence at his side was a declaration. They moved through the room, Kwan nodding to acquaintances, his expression once again a mask of cool neutrality. But his hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of both possession and protection. It did not feel like Marcus's grip. It was not an anchor of ownership. It was a point of contact, a silent communication of support. They found Marcus near the champagne fountain. He was a discordant note in the room's elegant symphony. His tuxedo was slightly rumpled. His face was flushed. He was holding a glass of whiskey, not champagne, and had clearly had several already. His eyes, when they landed on Ilara, were filled with a toxic mixture of rage, longing, and wounded pride. He looked at her emerald gown, then at Kwan's hand on her back, and his face contorted into a sneer. He pushed his way through a small crowd, his movements clumsy and aggressive. He came to a stop before them, his posture a parody of his old swagger. "Well, well," he slurred, his voice too loud for the room. "Look what the cat dragged in. Or should I say, what the snake slithered in with?" He ignored Kwan, focusing his entire venomous attention on Ilara. "That's a beautiful dress, Ilara," he said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I'm sure he paid a pretty penny for it. Did you tell him how much you like expensive things?" Ilara did not respond. She stood still, her chin high, her expression calm. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Kwan's hand on her back remained steady. He did not look at Marcus. He looked at a point over his shoulder, as if mildly bored. Marcus's frustration grew. He had expected tears, fear, a scene. Her composure infuriated him. "What are you doing with him?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Have you forgotten your obligations? You owe me. Everything you have, you owe to me." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "You belong to me. In all but name, you are my wife." He reached out, his hand aiming for her arm, a desperate, pathetic echo of his last assault. This time, Quan moved. It was not a fast movement. It was a simple, fluid step, placing himself directly between Marcus and Alara. His body was a sudden, immovable wall. Marcus's hand stopped, hovering in the air inches from Quan's chest. "Sit down, Marcus," Quan said. His voice was not loud, but it had a quality that made the nearby conversations cease. It was the voice of a man who had never had to repeat himself. Marcus laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You don't give me orders. You think you can just take what's mine? She is mine!" he shouted, finally acknowledging Quan. The entire ballroom was quiet now. Everyone was watching. This was the moment Marcus had craved, the center of attention. He did not realize it was his own execution. Quan looked at him then, truly looked at him, and his expression was one of clinical pity. "You are confused," he said, his voice calm and steady as iron wrapped in silk. "You seem to be operating under the misapprehension that you still own things." He began a quiet monologue, his voice never rising, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Let's review your portfolio, shall we? Rinaldi Imports, a fine company, but so dependent on its logistics partner. Oceanic Freight Solutions, a company which, as of 10 days ago, is a wholly owned subsidiary of my Singapore division. Your shipping costs have become prohibitive, I believe." Marcus's face began to lose its color. "What are you talking about?" "Then there is your real estate portfolio," Quan continued, ignoring him. "The downtown properties, very promising, but heavily leveraged. The debt was held by a consortium of smaller banks. My financial services branch found it to be a compelling investment. We consolidated that debt 4 days ago. The mortgage on your headquarters building, I hold it now. Your first payment is late." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. This was not a fistfight. This was a public dissection. "And finally," Quan said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate, more devastating, "your personal finances, the lines of credit, the stocks you held as collateral, all managed by a single boutique investment bank, Sterling Thorne, a fine institution, so fine in fact that I acquired a controlling interest in it this afternoon. The transaction was finalized at 5:47 p.m. Quan took out his phone. It was not for a call. He turned the screen toward Marcus, showing him a series of documents, a flurry of digital signatures. The final, damning proof. "You have been living on my credit for the past 3 hours, Marcus," Quan said, his voice a soft, final nail in the coffin. "You are, as of 63 minutes ago, entirely my employee, and your performance has been unsatisfactory. You are over-leveraged, your risk management is appalling, and your public conduct is a liability to my brand." The collapse was not sudden. It was a slow, horrifying crumble. The arrogant posture, the performative swagger, all of it dissolved like sand in water. Marcus Rinaldi stared at the phone screen, his mind struggling to process the scale of his own annihilation. He had come here to reclaim his possession, and had discovered he was one. He looked from the phone to Quan's impassive face, then to Alara's calm, steady gaze. He saw no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, final finality. He had been so wrong about everything, about power, about loyalty, about her. His knees gave way. It was not a dramatic fall. It was the quiet, sagging collapse of a puppet whose strings had been cut. He landed on the polished marble floor with a soft thud. The glass of whiskey shattered beside him, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. "No," he whispered. It was a sound of pure, childlike disbelief. Then came the begging, a low, pathetic whine directed at Quan. "Please, you can't. I'll do anything." His pleas devolved into ragged, uncontrollable sobs. He curled into a ball on the floor, a powerful man reduced to a weeping, broken child in a rumpled tuxedo. The ruin was absolute. It was public. It was total. Gala security, moving with practiced discretion, came forward and gently, firmly, helped the sobbing wreck of Marcus Rinaldi to his feet and escorted him from the ballroom, out of the story, out of the world he had tried to dominate. The silence he left behind was thick with shock and a kind of awed horror. Hundreds of the city's most powerful people had just witnessed a man being erased from existence with a few quiet words and a smartphone. Jinwoo Quan did not watch him go. He turned his back on the pathetic spectacle, his face unreadable. He looked at Alara, his eyes searching hers. She did not look away. She simply stood her ground, the emerald silk of her dress a beacon in the stunned room. Then Quan did something unexpected. He took the microphone from the nearby podium, the one meant for the evening's host. He tapped it once, the sound echoing through the ballroom. All eyes, which had been on the exit where Marcus had disappeared, snapped back to him. He did not mention Marcus. He did not acknowledge the demolition they had just witnessed. Instead, his hand came to rest again on the small of Alara's back, a steady, supportive pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and clear, filling the room. "My corporation has recently committed to funding a new, state-of-the-art cardiac center for St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital." A polite, if slightly dazed, smattering of applause broke out. He held up a hand for silence. The success of such a venture depends not on funding, but on vision and expertise. For years, the most capable person in every room at that hospital has gone largely unrecognized, her contributions absorbed into the successes of others. He turned his body slightly, presenting Alara to the room. He was not shielding her anymore. He was showcasing her. "I would like to introduce you to the woman who has agreed to oversee the architectural design and clinical protocol implementation for the new Quan Cardiac Center. A woman whose brilliance and grace under pressure are unparalleled, Miss Alara Vance." He handed her the microphone. For a heartbeat, Alara froze. The weight of the microphone was immense. She looked out at the sea of faces, powerful, wealthy, influential people, all staring at her. They were not seeing a victim. They were not seeing a gangster's mall. They were seeing the woman Jinwoo Quan had just described. They were seeing her, finally, as she was. She took a breath, the air filling her lungs feeling clean for the first time in years. She stepped forward to the center of the light. "Thank you, Mr. Quan," she said, her voice not trembling, but clear and strong. "I look forward to building something that will last." The applause, when it came, was thunderous. It was not for the spectacle. It was not for Quan's power. It was for her. It was a wave of validation, washing away the last remnants of Marcus's stain. In that moment, standing in the light, she was not his rescued damsel or his protected asset. She was his partner, his equal, vindicated. Later, they stood on a private balcony overlooking the city. The noise of the gala was a distant, pleasant hum, the soundtrack to a world that no longer concerned them. The cold night air felt good on her skin. Alara leaned against the railing, looking out at the endless grid of lights, and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years, 4 months, and what felt like a lifetime. A real smile reached her eyes. Not a polite smile or a weary smile, but one of pure, unadulterated relief. The heavy cloak of dread she had worn for so long had finally, truly been lifted. The world felt lighter. Quan stood beside her, not crowding her, a respectful distance between them. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say, "It's over." He simply watched her, his expression soft in the dim light. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice a low murmur. She turned to look at him, the man who had dismantled her tormentor, not with rage or violence, but with quiet, systemic precision. The man who had seen her competence when she thought no one was looking. The man who had offered her safety and then, more importantly, had offered her a platform. "You built a trap," she said, her voice filled with a kind of awe. "He was his own trap," Kwon corrected gently. "I merely provided the optimal environment for his nature to express itself." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I put you in a dangerous position tonight. I asked you to be bait." "I know," she said, "and I chose to accept. I don't leave because things become complicated, Mr. Kwon." "Jinwoo," he said. "My name is Jinwoo." "Jinwoo," she repeated. The name felt right. "I think," she said, turning back to the city. "I would like to go home now." He nodded. "Of course." But he didn't move. "Ilara," he said, his voice hesitant for the first time. "The Azure is a secure location. It is not a home. My home is 20 minutes from here. It is also secure, and much less silent." He looked at her. "I would be honored if you would consider it your home as well. Not as a guest, as a partner." It was not a declaration of love, not a passionate plea. It was a proposal, a merger, an offering of a shared future, built on the solid ground of mutual respect and earned trust. She thought of the cold, perfect silence of the penthouse. Then she thought of the quiet warmth of his presence, the rare humor in his eyes that mirrored his mother's, the profound, grounding feeling of being truly seen. "I think," she said, a real smile blooming on her face, "that I would like that very much." The final scenes of their story were not written in grand gestures but in quiet moments. They were written in the shared blueprints for the cardiac center spread across a dining room table. They were written in visits to his mother, who now fussed over Alara like her own daughter and critiqued Jinwoo's choice in neckties. They were written in late-night conversations that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with art and medicine and the future. One day, months later, they stood on a plot of land overlooking the ocean. The foundation of a new house poured at their feet. It was a house they were designing together. She was describing the way the morning light would hit the kitchen. He was listening, his arm around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was not a sovereign, and she was not a survivor. They were just two people, complicated and honest, building a home. A family built not from a whirlwind romance, but from the daily, deliberate choice to stay, to build, and to protect the quiet space they had made together. Some people will take your silence for weakness, your grace for compliance. They will misread your resilience as an invitation to test your limits. But true strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to perform. It's in the quiet competence, the steady hand, the unwavering heart that endures. And sometimes it takes a person who speaks the same quiet language of power to finally give that strength a voice in the safe harbor it has always deserved. What did you think of Jinwoo's method of dealing with Marcus? Was it justice or something else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of quiet strength and ultimate vindication moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button right now. It truly helps us bring more stories like this to you, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. The story of the Kwon Cardiac Center and the empire Ilara and Jinwoo build together is just beginning.